There is nothing more depressing than watching a family pretend they aren't broke. It kills me. They sit there with their expensive wine, smiling like phonies, while the bank is 5 minutes away from taking the house. I'm Melanie Barker. My parents skipped my graduation to bail my brother out of jail, then had the nerve to ask me to commit fraud to save his failing business. They thought I'd do it for family loyalty, but that's just a word people use when they want to use you. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. Now, let me tell you about the day I decided to stop being their daughter and start being their auditor. The numbers never lied to me. Only people did. I sat in my office, the hum of the hard drive, the only sound in the room, staring at a spreadsheet that detailed the systematic dismantling of a mid-sized construction firm. The owner had siphoned off payroll taxes to fund a gambling habit in Atlantic City, leaving his employees without Social Security contributions. It was a clean, brutal narrative written in the language of mathematics. To my colleagues at the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, I was Agent Barker, a forensic accountant with a reputation for ice water veins and an inability to overlook a single decimal point. To my family, I was just Melanie, the quiet girl who was good with numbers and worked a boring desk job in the city. They didn't know that my signature on a subpoena could freeze assets and shatter lives. They didn't know I had spent the last 6 years turning my heart into a ledger, balancing every slight, every omission, and every betrayal until the bottom line was finally ready to be drawn. And it all started with a graduation ceremony that nobody attended but me. Even now, 6 years later, the memory was as sharp as a paper cut. I could still smell the freshly cut grass of the university quad and feel the weight of the polyester gown on my shoulders. It was a humid day in mid-May, the air thick with anticipation and the buzz of excited families. I stood near the back of the folding chairs, scanning the sea of faces for Robert and Linda Barker. I had reserved their tickets months in advance. I had sent them the parking map. I had even mailed them a printed itinerary highlighted in yellow, ensuring they knew exactly where to sit to see me walk across the stage. I was the first person in our family to earn a college degree, graduating summa cum laude in accounting. It was supposed to be the proudest moment of our collective lives, but as the names were called, starting with the A's, the 2 seats I had saved remained empty. I checked my phone for the 10th time. No texts, no missed calls, just a voicemail I hadn't listened to yet, because I was terrified of what it might say. When Barker Melanie was called, I walked across the stage. I shook the dean's hand. I accepted the diploma. I smiled for the professional photographer, knowing that when the proof arrived in the mail, my eyes would look hollow. There was no cheering section for me, no bouquet of flowers waiting at the gate. I walked back to my seat, sat down, and finally pressed play on the voicemail. It was my mother's voice, breathless and frantic, but not about me. She was crying. "Melanie, honey, we can't make it. It's Todd. He was pulled over again. A DUI. They set bail at $10,000 because of his priors, and we had to drive down to the county lockup immediately to get him out. The lawyer says if we don't act fast, he could do real time. We're so sorry, but you understand, don't you? You're strong. You've always been the independent one. Todd is fragile. He needs us more right now." The message ended with a click. I sat there as the applause washed over me, feeling a cold stillness settle in my chest. They had liquidated the travel fund meant for my graduation weekend to bail my older brother out of jail for the 3rd time. My achievement was invisible. His failure was the center of their universe. That was the day I realized that in the Barker family economy, competence was taxed and incompetence was subsidized. I never forgot that equation. I moved to the city the next day, barely speaking to them for months. I built a career on the foundation of that solitude. I learned that the only thing you could truly rely on was a zero balance, no debts, no favors, no expectations. But the past has a way of accruing interest, and eventually the bill comes due. That bill arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in the form of a phone call from my father. Seeing Dad on the caller ID brought a familiar tightness to my jaw. We spoke perhaps once a month, usually brief conversations about the weather or my mother's sciatica. This time, his voice was different. It was tight-laced with a forced casualness that set my professional instincts on high alert. He asked me to come home for dinner that weekend. He said it was important. He said it was about the future. Against my better judgment, or perhaps driven by a morbid curiosity to see how deep the rot had gone, I agreed. The drive to the suburbs felt like traveling back in time. The house looked the same as it always had, a modest two-story colonial with peeling white paint and a lawn that was slightly overgrown. My parents, Robert and Linda, were people who believed in appearances, but they lacked the discipline to maintain them. As I pulled my sedan into the driveway, I noticed a brand new cherry red pickup truck parked sideways, blocking the garage. It had a decal on the door. Barker Transport. I stared at it for a moment, piecing together the rumors I had heard. Todd had started a business. My stomach turned. Todd couldn't manage a lemonade stand without drinking the inventory. Yet here was a commercial vehicle that cost more than my first two cars combined. I took a deep breath, composed my face into a mask of neutral politeness, and walked to the front door. Dinner was a performance. My mother had made a pot roast, my favorite, which she served with a side of guilt. "We see you so little these days, Melanie," she said, piling carrots onto my plate. "You're always so busy with your accounting." She said the word as if it were a hobby, something I did to pass the time while waiting for a husband. Todd sat across from me, looking older than his 32 years. His face was puffy, his eyes shifting restlessly around the room. He wore a polo shirt with the company logo embroidered on the chest, looking the part of the successful entrepreneur he was pretending to be. My father sat at the head of the table, radiating a nervous energy that made the silverware clatter loudly against the china. They made small talk until the plates were cleared, and then the atmosphere shifted. My father cleared his throat, placing both hands flat on the table. "Melanie," he began, his tone serious, "we wanted to talk to you because we're at a turning point, a good turning point. As you know, we helped Todd get Barker Transport off the ground last year." I nodded slowly. Helped was a euphemism. I knew my parents' finances better than they thought I did. They didn't have capital to invest. "We believe in him," my mother added, reaching out to squeeze Todd's hand. "He's really turning his life around, but growing pains are normal in business. Cash flow is a little tight right now." Todd looked down at the tablecloth, feigning humility. "I've got contracts lined up, Mel," he said, his voice smooth, the practiced cadence of a liar. "Big contracts, but the banks are being sticklers. They want to see 2 years of profit, and we've only been open for 14 months. The overhead is killing me. The trucks, the insurance, the fuel." "We need a bridge loan," my father interrupted, cutting to the chase. "Just to get over the hump. There's a specialized lender willing to look at us, but they need audited financials. They need the books to look robust." The silence that followed was heavy. I looked from my father to my mother and then to Todd. I saw the desperation in their eyes, but I also saw the entitlement. They weren't asking for advice. They were asking for an accomplice. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" I asked, my voice steady. My father sighed as if explaining something to a child. "You know how these things work. You're an accountant. You know how to move things around, categorize expenses differently, make the assets look stronger than the liabilities, just for the application. Once the loan comes through, Todd can pay everything back, and the books will balance out in reality. It's just a temporary fix. For family." I felt a cold rage crystallize in my gut. They had cashed out their 401k for this. I could tell by the way my father's hands shook. They had likely mortgaged the house to the hilt to buy that shiny truck in the driveway. And now that Todd had inevitably run the business into the ground, they wanted me to use my license, my career, and my integrity to commit bank fraud to keep the illusion alive. They wanted me to bail him out, just like they did on my graduation day. "You want me to look at the books?" I stated, not as a question. "We want you to fix them," Todd corrected, finally meeting my eyes with a smirk that suggested he thought I owed him this. "Mom and Dad put everything into this, Mel. If we don't get this loan, the business folds. And If the business folds. He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't have to. If the business folded, my parents were destitute. I'll look at them, I said. The lie tasted like copper in my mouth, but it was necessary. I needed access. I needed evidence. If I said no now, they would just find some storefront tax preparer to do a sloppy job and potentially get away with it for another year while bleeding my parents dry. If I did it, I controlled the narrative. Thank you, honey. My mother exhaled, looking relieved as if the problem was already solved. I knew we could count on you. You've always been the smart one. The praise felt like a slap. They didn't value my intelligence. They valued its utility in cleaning up their mess. I need everything, I said, standing up. Bank statements, invoices, payroll records, tax returns, everything, tonight. Todd nodded, eager now. It's all in the home office. A bit messy, but it's all there. I walked toward the study, my heels clicking on the hardwood floor. They thought I was going in there to save them. They had no idea I was walking in there to bury them. The home office smelled of stale cigar smoke and desperation. I closed the door, locking it purely out of habit, and sat down at the chaotic desk. What I found wasn't just poor bookkeeping. It was a forensic accountant's playground, a disaster so blatant it felt almost insulting. Todd hadn't even bothered to buy accounting software. Instead, there were stacks of handwritten ledgers, a mountain of crumpled receipts stuffed into a shoebox, and a laptop with a generic spreadsheet open. I cracked my knuckles and began the work. For the first hour, I was simply organizing, turning the chaos into data. I entered every receipt, every withdrawal, and every credit card swipe into my own secure laptop. As the rows filled up, the picture shifted from incompetence to malice. In my line of work, we look for patterns. We look for the lifestyle that doesn't match the income. And there it was, glaring at me from the screen in high-definition red. The irregularities were structural. I found a recurring monthly payment of $4,000 to an entity listed as Consulting Services, J. Miller. I knew J. Miller. It was Jason Miller, Todd's high school friend, who had never held a steady job in his life. There were no invoices for services rendered, no contracts, just cash bleeding out of the company operating account into a friend's pocket. Then came the vehicle expenses. The cherry red truck in the driveway was just the tip of the iceberg. Buried under fleet maintenance, I found lease payments for a luxury SUV registered to Todd personally, along with thousands of dollars in gas charges that geographically placed the vehicle in casinos 3 states away, not on any delivery route. But the most egregious offense was the travel and entertainment category. A logistics company in the suburbs had no business expensing a week-long trip to Cabo San Lucas as client acquisition, especially when the credit card statement showed charges at nightclubs and jet ski rentals rather than conference centers. Todd wasn't running a business. He was running a personal slush fund, using our parents' retirement savings as the capital. The door handle rattled, and then Todd walked in, not bothering to knock. He held 2 beers, offering me one with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. I declined. He leaned against the edge of the desk, looking down at my screen. "Finding the magic?" he asked, taking a swig. "Mom and Dad are pacing in the living room. They think you're in here performing surgery." I swiveled the chair to face him. I didn't smile. "I'm looking at the numbers, Todd. You're insolvent. You've burned through 80% of the seed capital in 14 months, and your revenue is barely covering the interest on the credit cards." I turned the screen toward him, pointing to the line items I had highlighted. "Jason Miller, the Cabo trip, the SUV. This is embezzlement, Todd. It's corporate theft." Todd didn't flinch. He actually laughed, a low, dismissive sound that made my skin crawl. "Relax, Mel. You're so uptight. It's a family business. That means the money is family money. Mom and Dad know I'm taking a little off the top to keep up appearances. You have to look successful to be successful, right? It's basically my inheritance early." He took another drink, his eyes hardening slightly. "Look, the bank doesn't need to know about Jason or the trip. Just reclassify them. Put the consulting fees under labor and the travel under operations. Hide the SUV lease and the equipment depreciation. You know how to do it. Cook the books, Mel, just enough to get the loan approved. Once the bank releases the new funds, I'll pay everything back. I swear." He was asking me to commit federal bank fraud. He was asking me to use my credentials to deceive a lending institution so he could continue to drain our parents dry. If you don't get this loan, I said, quietly, the business collapses. Mom and Dad lose the house. They lose everything. Todd shrugged, a gesture of terrifying nonchalance. That's why you're going to help us. Because if I go down, they go down. And you don't want to be the reason Mom and Dad are homeless, do you? He patted my shoulder, a condescending tap, and walked out of the room. Don't take too long. Dessert is waiting. I sat there for another 10 minutes, the silence ringing in my ears. I needed to be sure. I needed to know if the rod extended to the root. I saved my files to an encrypted drive, closed my laptop, and walked out to the kitchen. My parents looked up expectantly. They were eating apple pie, the domestic scene clashing violently with the crime scene I had just analyzed. Well, my father asked, his fork hovering halfway to his mouth. Is it fixed? It's not a clerical error, Dad, I said, standing at the end of the table. Todd is stealing from the company. He's paying his friends fake salaries. He's using the business account for vacations and personal cars. The money is gone. There is no profit to show the bank because he spent it all. I watched my mother's face crumble, but my father's face turned a deep, angry red. He slammed his fork down. That is enough, he shouted. I don't want to hear your accusations. Todd told us he had some startup costs. He told us he needed to wine and dine clients. He went to Cabo, Dad. He's paying Jason Miller $4,000 a month to do nothing. I countered, keeping my voice level. If I falsify these records to get a loan, I am committing a felony. And but when he defaults on that loan, the bank will come for everything you have left. The business is dead. You need to cut your losses now, before you lose the house. My father stood up, looming over the table. You are jealous. He spat, pointing a trembling finger at me. You have always been jealous of him because he has spirit, and you have calculations. You sit in your apartment with your cat and your spreadsheets, and you can't stand to see your brother trying to build a legacy. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a menacing growl. We paid for that degree of yours, Melanie. We supported you. Now you use that degree to save this family. I don't care what you have to do to the numbers. You fix it. You get that loan approved. Do you understand me? If this business fails, it is on your head. My mother looked down at her plate, refusing to meet my eyes. She was choosing him. Again. Even with the truth laid bare, they preferred the comfortable lie of Todd's potential over the harsh reality of my integrity. I understand, I said softly. And I did. I finally understood that I wasn't a daughter to them. I was a resource to be exploited, a safety net they despised, using, but felt entitled to. I'll handle the paperwork. I didn't stay for dessert. I gathered my things, walked past Todd, who was watching TV in the living room, and drove back to the city. The drive was a blur of highway lights and cold determination. When I got to my apartment, I didn't go to sleep. I set up my workstation. I didn't cook the books. I didn't change a single decimal point to help them. Instead, I opened a new file. I compiled the bank statements, the sham invoices, the emails I had synchronized from Todd's unsecured laptop, and the fraudulent loan application he had already partially filled out. I organized the evidence with the ruthlessness of a surgeon removing a tumor. Then I logged into the IRS portal. I downloaded Form 211, the application for award for original information. I filled out the fields with steady hands. Taxpayer name Barker Transport, Todd Barker. Alleged violation, embezzlement, tax evasion, bank, fraud. I attached the dossier I had created. I wasn't just reporting a stranger. I was reporting my brother. I was sealing the fate of my parents. But as I reviewed the file one last time, I thought of the empty seats at my graduation. I thought of my father's finger in my face demanding I become a criminal to protect their golden boy. They wanted me to be involved. Fine. I was involved now. I was the auditor. I clicked submit, watching the progress bar load until it reached 100%. The receipt number flashed on the screen. It was done. I closed the laptop, and for the first time in 6 years, I slept soundly. 3 months is the standard gestation period for a federal takedown of this magnitude. It takes time to corroborate evidence, secure grand jury indictments, and coordinate the simultaneous seizure of assets across multiple locations. I knew the timeline down to the day, so when my mother called to invite me to a victory dinner, I knew exactly what kind of celebration it was going to be. I checked the docket, confirmed the issuance of the warrants, and accepted the invitation. I wore a dark navy dress, simple and severe, the kind of outfit one wears to a funeral or a deposition. The mood inside the Barker house was electric with unearned triumph. My father had bought a bottle of Dom Perignon, undoubtedly charged to a credit card that was about to be frozen, and Todd was holding court at the head of the table, his cheeks flushed with alcohol and arrogance. He looked like a man who had gotten away with it. "To the expansion," Todd bellowed, raising his glass. "And to my little sister for finally putting that degree to good use and smoothing over the misunderstandings with the bank." My parents beamed at me, their faces soft with relief. They truly believed I had committed the fraud they requested. They believed the silence from the bank was just administrative lag and that the influx of cash was imminent. "We're proud of you, Melanie." My mother said, her eyes misty. "You finally prioritized family." I took a small sip of water. I didn't drink champagne. It clouded the judgment. "The numbers always tell a story," I said, neutrally. "I just ensured they told the right one." Todd laughed, slapping the table. "Exactly, creative accounting. That's what the big guys do. We're finally playing in the big leagues." He began to detail his plans for the new loan money, a larger warehouse, a new fleet of trucks, perhaps a boat for client entertainment. My father nodded along, captivated by the fantasy of dynastic wealth. They were so busy counting chickens that didn't exist that they didn't notice the sudden rhythmic flashing of blue lights filtering through the sheer dining room curtains. I noticed. I checked my watch. 7:00 p.m. Right on schedule. The heavy thud of a battering ram against the front door wasn't necessary. It was unlocked, but the shock and awe were part of the procedure. Before my father could even stand up to investigate the noise, the front door flew open. "Federal agents, nobody move hands where we can see them." The room exploded into chaos. 6 agents from the Criminal Investigation Division poured into the dining room, their windbreakers emblazoned with the yellow IRS CID bold lettering. Behind them came state auditors and local police. The sound of heavy boots on the hardwood floor drowned out my mother's scream. "What is this? Who are you?" My father shouted, his face turning from flush to pale ash. "We're eating dinner. Get out of my house." A lead agent, a tall woman with eyes as hard as flint, ignored him and walked straight to Todd. "Todd Barker?" she asked. Todd, who had been boasting about his business acumen seconds ago, looked like a child who had wet the bed. He stammered, dropping his champagne glass. It shattered, the expensive liquid pooling on the rug. I... Todd Barker, you are under arrest for 18 counts of wire fraud, tax evasion, and conspiracy to defraud a financial institution," she recited, pulling his arms behind his back. The click of the handcuffs was the loudest sound in the room. "This is a mistake," my mother shrieked, grabbing the arm of an agent who was already boxing up files from the sideboard. "My son is a businessman. He's expecting a loan. Tell them, Robert. Tell them—" My father was sputtering, trying to use his physical bulk to block the hallway leading to the home office. But 2 officers gently but firmly moved him aside. "Sir, we have a federal search warrant for this residence and the business premises. Step back, or you will be detained for obstruction." Robert turned to me, his eyes wide and wild. "Melanie, do something. You fixed the books, you told us it was handled. Tell them there's been a mistake." I remained seated, my hands folded in my lap, watching the agents dismantle the life my parents had built on lies. I didn't say a word. The front door opened again and a man walked in, who changed the texture of the panic in the room. It was Silas Henderson, the family's former financial advisor and the registered agent for Barker Transport. He was a man in his 60s, carrying a leather briefcase, looking tired and grim. The agents had summoned him as the legal representative of the entity being seized. My parents' faces lit up with a desperate hope. "Silas," my father cried out. "Thank God. You have to stop this. These people are crazy. They're arresting Todd." Silas didn't rush to comfort them. He walked into the dining room, surveyed the shattered glass and the handcuffs, and then looked at me. He gave me a barely perceptible nod before turning to my parents. "I can't stop this, Robert," Silas said, his voice grave. "I'm here to accept service of the seizure order for the corporation. It's over." "What do you mean it's over?" My mother sobbed, clutching her napkin. "We just need to clear up the accounting errors. Melanie fixed them." Silas sighed, a sound of deep, exhausted frustration. "Melanie didn't fix anything, Linda. And frankly, neither did I. Do you remember our meeting 5 years ago when you inherited the money?" The room went silent, save for the rustling of evidence bags. My parents looked confused. "I told you then," Silas continued, his voice raising slightly to cut through the denial. "I sat at this very table and advised you to put your retirement funds into a protected trust. I advised you to let Melanie be the trustee. I told you that Todd was a financial liability and that giving him access to capital was like handing a loaded gun to a toddler. You screamed at me. You told me I didn't understand family loyalty. You fired me as your advisor and kept me on only to file your 1040s because I was cheap. Well, Robert, look around you. This is exactly what I told you would happen." My father looked as if he had been punched in the gut. He looked at Todd, who was weeping as he was led toward the door, and then he looked at Silas. "But Melanie," he stammered. "She's an accountant. She went over the books 3 months ago. She said she would help." Silas looked at me with a mixture of professional respect and personal sorrow. "She did help, Robert, just not the way you wanted." My father slowly turned his head toward me. The realization hit him in waves. He saw the lack of surprise on my face. He saw the calm posture. He saw the agents walking past me without asking for my ID, treating me like a piece of the furniture they were expecting to find. "You," he whispered. "You knew." My mother stopped crying and stared at me, horror dawning in her eyes. "Melanie, why aren't you saying anything? Why aren't you helping your brother?" I finally stood up. I smoothed the fabric of my dress. I looked at Todd, who was being manhandled out the door, and then I looked at the parents who had sacrificed my graduation for his freedom. "I didn't cook the books, Dad," I said, my voice clear and carrying to every corner of the silent room. "I audited them." The silence that followed was absolute. "I found the embezzlement. I found the fraud. And I filed the whistleblower report that brought them here tonight." My father looked at me with pure hatred, a look I had seen him give to debt collectors and rivals, but never to me. "You betrayed your family," he hissed. "You destroyed us." "No," I corrected him, picking up my purse. "I balanced the equation. You spent 30 years enabling a criminal because he was your son, and you ignored the daughter who actually followed the rules. You destroyed yourselves when you trusted a thief instead of a professional. I just made sure the math finally added up." I walked past Silas, who stepped aside to let me pass. I walked past the agents who ignored me. I walked out the front door, past the police cars and the neighbors gathering on their lawns to watch the spectacle. I didn't look back at the house. I got into my car, checked my phone to ensure my flight for the morning was on time, and drove away. The rearview mirror was filled with red and blue lights, a kaleidoscope of consequences that finally beautifully belonged to someone else. The deconstruction of a life takes significantly less time than the building of one. In the weeks following the raid, I watched the systematic dismantling of the Barker family legacy from the sterile safety of my condo, tracking the progress through public court dockets and auction listings. It was a fascinating, if grim, case study in cause and effect. Barker Transport was dissolved within 48 hours, the assets frozen by a federal judge who saw the evidence exactly as I had presented it, irrefutable. The fleet of trucks, including the cherry red pickup my father had been so proud of, was seized to satisfy the initial tax liens. The warehouse lease was terminated. The employees, mostly Todd's friends on the payroll, scattered like cockroaches exposed to sudden light, leaving behind a hollow shell of a corporation. But the real devastation wasn't corporate. It was personal. My parents had made the fatal error of signing personal guarantees for every loan Todd took out. They had put their names on the dotted line, pledging their home, their savings, and their future as collateral for a business run by a man who treated revenue like an allowance. When the business defaulted, the creditors didn't just write it off. They pivoted. They came for the co-signers. I didn't answer my phone during those weeks. The voicemail box filled up within 2 days, a digital graveyard of my mother's sobbing pleas and my father's alternating rage and bargaining. I listened to them only once, transcribing the relevant threats from my own records before deleting them. I knew the timeline. First, the bank accounts would be drained. Then the foreclosure notice would be taped to the front door of the house I grew up in. Finally, the eviction. It was a mathematical certainty. I continued to go to work, my routine unchanged. I filed my reports, I drank my black coffee, and I slept in a bed that I owned outright. I felt a strange, hollow peace. It wasn't happiness, exactly. It was the satisfaction of a chaotic equation finally resolving to zero. The ambiguity was gone. They had made their choice 6 years ago. The bill had simply arrived late. The inevitable knocked on my door 3 weeks after the arrest. It was a Saturday morning, the sky a bruised purple over the city skyline. My condo building had strict security, but I had forgotten to remove my parents from the authorized guest list I had set up years ago when I first moved in a vestige of a hope I had long since abandoned. When the buzzer rang, the concierge simply announced, "Mr. and Mrs. Barker are here for you," and sent the elevator up before I could decline. I stood in my foyer wearing a silk robe, sipping tea, and waited. When the knock came, it was hesitant, lacking the entitlement that usually defined my father's presence. I opened the door. They looked like refugees from a war they had started. My father, usually impeccably dressed in pressed slacks and polo shirts, wore a wrinkled windbreaker and track pants. He looked shrunken, as if the stress had physically metabolized his muscle mass. My mother stood behind him, clutching an oversized purse and dragging 2 large suitcases on wheels. Her eyes were red-rimmed and swollen, her hair unkempt. Behind them in the hallway were 3 cardboard boxes, taped shut, the sum total of 40 years of marriage salvaged from a foreclosure. They didn't speak immediately. They just stared at me, and for a moment, the sheer pathetic reality of them hung in the air. "Melanie," my mother finally whispered, her voice cracking. "They took the house. The marshals came this morning. They gave us an hour." She gestured vaguely to the luggage. "We have nowhere else to go." My father cleared his throat, trying to summon a shred of his old authority, but it crumbled before it left his lips. "We need a place to stay," he said, avoiding my eyes, "just until we get on our feet, until we figure out the legal situation with Todd." He stepped forward, assuming I would step back to let them in. I didn't move. I planted my feet on the marble tile, my hand resting on the doorframe, creating a physical barrier. "You can't stay here," I said. My voice was calm, devoid of the hysteria that radiated from them. It was a statement of fact, not a negotiation. My father stopped blinking, as if I had spoken in a foreign language. "What?" he asked. "Melanie, be reasonable. We are your parents. We are homeless. You have a guest room. I know you do. You have plenty of space." "I do have a guest room," I acknowledged, "but it's not for you." My mother let out a sharp gasp, dropping the handle of the suitcase. "How can you be so cruel?" she cried, the tears starting again. "We are family. Family helps each other when they are down. We made a mistake with Todd. Fine, we admit it. But you can't punish us like this. You can't leave us on the street." "Family," I repeated the word, tasting the bitterness of it. That's an interesting word. Let's talk about family. 6 years ago, family was a graduation ceremony. I stood on a lawn in a cap and gown, scanning the crowd for the 2 people who were supposed to be there. I had a 4.0 GPA. I had honors. I had done everything right. I looked at my father directly. "And where were you? You were in a bail bondsman's office, handing over the money meant for my celebration to get Todd out of a drunk tank. You told me on a voicemail that he needed you more. You established the hierarchy, then Todd's failures were more important than my successes. Todd's comfort was worth more than my milestone. That was years ago. My father shouted, his face flushing. Get over it. He is your brother. He was in trouble. He is always in trouble. I snapped back, my voice rising for the first time. And you always bailed him out. You taught him that there were no consequences. And when he decided to play businessman with your retirement fund, you didn't stop him. You enabled him. And when he started stealing, you tried to make me an accessory to fraud to cover it up. You didn't come here today because you love me. You came here because you used up all your resources on him, and I'm the only asset you haven't liquidated yet. I looked at the luggage, then back at them. I am not your retirement plan. I am not your safety net. I am the daughter you ignored until you needed something. My mother stepped forward, reaching for my hand, but I pulled back. Melanie, please. She begged, her dignity completely gone. We have no money. The accounts are frozen. We have Social Security and that's it. We can't afford a hotel. We can't afford an apartment. What will we do? How will we survive? I looked at her, remembering the cold wind on my face as I walked back to my dorm room alone with my diploma. I remembered the instant noodles I ate that night while my roommates went out to dinner with their proud parents. I remembered the silence of my phone. I had learned a vital lesson that day, one they were just beginning to learn now. You'll figure it out, I said, my voice dropping back to that icy professional register. I learned independence the day I graduated alone. I learned that nobody is coming to save you. I learned that you eat what you kill, and you live within your means. I gripped the edge of the door, preparing to close it. You're adults. You have Social Security. Go find a motel. Go find a shelter. Go ask Todd's friends. But do not come here. I will never forgive you for this. My father spat, his face twisted in hate. You are cold. You have ice in your veins. I have solvency, I corrected him. And I have peace. Melanie, my mother screamed as I began to push the door shut. We're your parents. You owe us. I audited the ledger. I said, looking them in the eye one last time. The debt is paid. We are even. I closed the heavy oak door. The sound of the latch clicking into place was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. I engaged the deadbolt. I turned around, leaning my back against the wood, listening to the muffled shouting and banging from the hallway. I didn't call the police. Security would remove them soon enough. I walked into my living room, the silence rushing back in to fill the space clean and pure. I went to the window and watched the city below, a world of indifferent lights. I was alone, yes, but for the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for anyone to show up. Justice, I found, is not a lightning bolt from the sky. It is a slow, grinding bureaucracy that eventually processes everyone into their correct category. In the 6 months following the raid and the subsequent collapse of the Barker family facade, the legal system digested my brother and parents with the same indifferent efficiency I applied to my spreadsheets. I didn't attend the sentencing hearing. I didn't need to see it to know the outcome. The plea deal had been public record for weeks. Todd, facing the overwhelming weight of the evidence I had compiled, the undeniable paper trail of wire fraud and tax evasion, had pleaded guilty to avoid a trial that would have buried him for 20 years. Instead, he received 5 years in a federal correctional facility in Pennsylvania. It was a light sentence by some standards, but for a man like Todd, whose entire identity was built on unearned comfort and the adoration of his parents, it was a death sentence for his ego. He would emerge in his late 30s with a felony record, no credit, and a ban from ever serving as an officer of a corporation again. The golden boy had been smelted down to base metal. My parents' fate was less cinematic, but in many ways, more devastating. Without the house and with their credit scores pulverized by the defaults, they were washed out of the middle class entirely. The social circle they had preened for the neighbors they had tried to impress with the new truck and the talk of business expansion abandoned them the moment the foreclosure sign went up. Shame is a powerful isolator in suburbia. They were forced to leave the town they had lived in for 40 years. Through a distant aunt, I heard they had secured a small, one-bedroom unit in a state-subsidized senior living facility 3 counties over. They were living entirely on their basic Social Security checks. There were no more country club lunches, no more leased luxury cars, and certainly no more bail money. They had become the very thing they always looked down upon, people who had failed to plan people who were dependent on the system. They were safe, they were fed, but they were irrelevant. They had sacrificed their financial immortality to build a shrine to a false idol. And now they were left to live in the ruins. My own transition was far more lucrative. 8 months after I filed Form 211, a thick envelope arrived at my condo with the Department of the Treasury return address. I opened it with a letter opener, slicing cleanly through the paper. Inside was the official determination from the IRS whistleblower office. Because the total recovery of taxes, penalties, and interest from the seizure of Barker Transport and my parents' personal assets had exceeded the statutory threshold, and because the information I provided was classified as original and specific, I was awarded 20% of the collected proceeds. I looked at the check. It was a substantial sum, enough to buy a house cash, enough to start a new life, without ever looking at a price tag again. I didn't feel a surge of joy. I felt the cold, hard satisfaction of a contract fulfilled. The system worked. Merit was rewarded. Corruption was penalized. It was the only language I truly spoke. I resigned from my position at the field office 2 weeks later. I wasn't running away. I was simply relocating to a better market. I had accepted a transfer to a specialized forensic unit in a coastal city, a place where the ocean air would scour the last of the suburban dust from my lungs. I packed my life into a few high-quality suitcases. I sold the condo. I donated the furniture. I left nothing behind that could tether me to the past. The final scene of my old life took place at the departure gate of the airport. I sat in a comfortable leather chair in the first-class lounge watching the plane's taxi on the tarmac. My phone buzzed. It was a number I didn't recognize, likely a burner phone, or a public line from the facility where my parents now lived. I let it ring. I watched the screen light up, vibrating against the side table, demanding my attention one last time. I thought about answering. I thought about hearing my mother's voice, likely vacillating between guilt-tripping me and begging for money. I thought about my father's potential rage, or worse, his broken, pathetic apology. But then I remembered the ledger. I remembered the graduation. I remembered the request to commit fraud. I remembered the look on Silas Henderson's face when he realized they had ignored his advice to trust me. The phone stopped ringing. A voicemail notification popped up. I swiped it away without listening. I blocked the number. Then I opened my banking app. I looked at the balance, the numbers stark and beautiful against the white background. It wasn't just money. It was freedom. It was the tangible proof that competence pays and enabling costs. I had audited my family and I had closed the account. The liabilities were written off. The equity remained with me. Flight 492 to San Diego, now boarding Group 1. The announcer's voice cut through the lounge, smooth and inviting. I stood up, picking up my bag. I walked toward the gate, my heels clicking rhythmically on the polished floor. I didn't look back at the city skyline, visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows. There was nothing back there for me but bad debt. I handed my boarding pass to the attendant. The machine beeped a pleasant confirmation, and I walked down the jet bridge. Justice, I realized as I stepped onto the plane, is just another form of mathematics. If you subtract the dead weight, you can finally fly. That brings us to the end of Melanie's calculated audit. It serves as a reminder that sometimes the only way to find peace is to subtract the people holding you back. If you found this story satisfying, please subscribe to the channel. Let us know. Your take, did Melanie do the right thing? We read every single comment of your thoughts. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Ashes of Revenge. We'll see you next time.